Great. My name is Simon Kiss. As Boone said, I'm a political scientist at Wilfrid Laurier University. I'm very glad to be here. It's my first sabbatical, and I found that the sabbatical experience for younger faculty in my generation is a little bit different than maybe some of the awe-inspiring stories that we heard from our mentors about spending a year in the south of France when spouses maybe didn't have fulfilling career commitments of their own, and housing prices were maybe cheaper. So, the opportunities for travel and kind of talking to new people and meeting with new people are a little bit different. So it's great to be at a university in Canada that has great universities like Syracuse that are within a day's reach. So this project is about open government as a concept, and particularly about the definitions of open government. But more importantly, it's about how people have a proclivity to define concepts in ways that suit their interests. It's a bit of a side project for me, but it's rooted in my interest in political communication, particularly my interest in scrutinizing journalism and journalists and the consequences that they have for politics and public policy. So the research that I'm presenting today, it's been accepted in the Canadian Journal of Political Science, so it's forthcoming there, so you can look for that in the next year, hopefully, or depending on the rate of how scholarly publishing goes these days, maybe in the next 2 years it'll finally make it to hardcover, but it has been accepted there. So speaking of spouses, my wife is a phenomenal presenter, and she's really great at distilling presentations and research findings down to the core elements. So I'm sort of taking her advice here, and I'm just giving you the conclusions of the research first. So here's your headline findings. This is what you can take away from the talk and the research. Journalists in our survey preferred definitions of open government that emphasize information, access to information, and sources. Government parliamentarians preferred definitions of open government that emphasize debate and public participation. And opposition parliamentarians occupied a middle ground between the two. And lastly, most importantly, these findings, they were robust actually to controls for other theories, other factors, other variables. We tested for ideology, age, language, and gender. And even after controlling for those four confounding variables, the effects of the position that a respondent was in still showed up. So people chose and ranked definitions of open government in those particular ways, and they were different depending on the kind of the position that they were in the survey. So ultimately, we're kind of motivated a little bit by a critique of the concept of open government, and we're partially wondering whether or not it's actually viable. And so this quote from as all great political science research and all great political science puzzles ultimately find their roots or have their genesis in an episode of Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, so does this one. You can quote Sir Humphrey, you can have openness or you can have government. You can't have both at the same time. Now, I don't necessarily accept that, but that's kind of a motivating sort of question that we have, and that kind of motivates the survey that we did, and it's maybe a question that's worth thinking about when we look at the results that we get. So the background to this project was basically a policy conflict in Ontario over electricity production. So in 2003, the incoming Liberal government had made a promise to shut down coal-fired power plants to reduce carbon emissions and to deal with air pollution, particularly in the GTA, which could be quite bad. And the problem was coal made up about a quarter of Ontario's electricity production. So you have to make that up somehow. And the solution was partially renewables, but more importantly, it was to expand the use of natural gas in producing electricity. To maximize the efficiency of these plants, you want to get them as close as possible to the consumers because you can minimize the loss of electricity along the wires. And so they did, I think, 19 in total. 2 of them were set up. One was here in Oakville, so this is downtown Toronto here, which you all, I'm sure, have some idea where that is. You might be able to see the tower from across the lake. One was here in Oakville, and one was right here in the larger city of Mississauga. Both of these are affluent, highly educated, not Tony, but affluent suburbs west of the GTA. Very quickly, these plans generated a lot of local opposition. So you can maybe see where this is going to go. Fast forward to 2011, and the Liberals get reelected in 2007, and in 2011 they're fighting a very, very tough re-election battle. The election's very close, and they need every seat that they can get. So I think about 6 months before the election is dropped, they cancel the Oakville plant. And literally about a week before the election started, they canceled the Mississauga plant. The problem was, of course, contracts had been signed, construction had started. Canceling contracts incurs costs. Everybody knew that was going to happen when they made the announcement, but it went over very popular. It went over very well in, we can count the seats, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5 seats. The Liberals held Oakville, and they won 4 out of 5 Mississauga seats. And they narrowly retained control of the government in a minority parliament. So they kind of got by with the skin of their teeth. But the decision to cancel the plants definitely helped them win the election. Of course, like I said, everybody knew this was going to incur major costs. The total cost to the taxpayer was about $1 billion Canadian, so fairly significant. And that set off like a year-long media frenzy and a scandal. Ultimately, the premier, he won the election, but he had to resign the year later, large part as a result of the scandal over this. And it set off a feeding frenzy by the media and opposition politicians looking for who to blame, asking questions like, how did this happen? Who did this? And who's accountable? And this is where we kind of got interested in this debate. So part of the feeding frenzy occurred because the opposition parties, because it was a minority parliament, the 2 opposition parties controlled the committees in the legislature, so they were actually able to compel documents from the government, internal kind of correspondence and documents from the government. They did that. Something like 20 or 30,000 pages of internal government correspondence was released and poured over by journalists, opposition politicians, all looking for a smoking gun. And my colleague, George Wooden, who's the co-author on the paper, and I were looking at the debate a little bit mystified because in a lot of ways it was obvious what had happened, who was responsible. The premier was responsible. He made the decision to cancel power plants to save seats. Like, this is not a complicated story here. So you can look for smoking guns in piles of government documents all you want, but you're never going to find anything that says other than what is patently obvious, which is that the premier did what politicians do, which is make kind of short-term decisions to win votes. What the debate was not about was how best or what costs and benefits are associated with the different ways of producing electricity in Ontario. Each type of way of generating electricity brings a mix of costs and benefits. Nuclear is expensive, but you have to deal with the waste. Renewables are expensive, but unreliable. Natural gas is cheaper and cleaner, but you have to put the plants near where people live, right? And so nowhere was there a conversation where the public and the voters and the politicians were having an honest, open conversation about how best to move forward producing electricity the province needed. They were all talking about who did this, who was responsible, who was accountable. And so after the premier resigned, the Liberals had a leadership election, and the successor to McGuinty, that premier, made a big push in her campaign to emphasize open government. We're going to make open government more open. We're going to be more transparent. We're going to increase consultations. We're going to be more accessible. We're going to increase open data. And we thought that she did this for 2 reasons. One was it loosely kind of addressed this lingering concern about all these documents that were released and attempts to find out who was accountable. It sort of looked like she was addressing that problem, which was not much of a problem, but it was also cheap, right? It's a cheap promise for a politician to make. But it got us then wondering about this concept of open government and how it had been defined and why it had been defined in such a way so as to be equated with kind of access to information and documents and kind of facts, and not equated with an alternative definition that we thought was actually kind of plausible, which might be open government might be an open, like a conversation that you have with your spouse or your children about a kind of a difficult decision that has to be made, right? Like open government might be, a different way of thinking about open government might be, we need to have an open and honest conversation about some of the difficult challenges that we're having. That was not how people were thinking of open government. They were thinking about it in terms of, we'll give you more statistics, we'll consult with you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we got interested in how do people define open government and do they define it differently? So we decided to do a survey to test some hypotheses associated with this. So we scanned the academic literature and the policy literature, the public administration literature, looking for definitions of open government. It is a little bit tricky to define. It is an issue in the literature, the kind of the ambiguous definition of open government. Often it's almost always linked to other positively valenced concepts like accountability, transparency, participation, collaboration. So you can think of open government as operating at the center of kind of a web with links to kind of other concepts that no one would ever really disagree with. There's an international organization called the Open Government Partnership that has kind of 4 cores that it emphasizes. There's also a non-governmental organization called Transparency International that develops standards for transparency. And there's a kind of a growing subdiscipline. So it's an active field, and the difficulties defining it is a noted kind of concept. So we scanned the literature and we settled on basically 7 different definitions here that we wrote. These are not definitions that you would find worded in any of that documentation. It's our own kind of wording. And we kind of linked it back to higher level concepts that we saw circulating in the policy literature and the scholarly literature, namely accountability, information, participation. This one is a little bit of our own kind of hobby horse. We really like the idea of open government as trade-offs. We sort of, we're academics. We'd like to see mature policy debate that is honest and emphasizes the trade-offs. So you probably won't find this in any academic literature. This is our hobby horse. This is us being a little bit creative and sort of saying, we should be thinking about open government in this way. I don't think you will find this often, but it's our attempt at being a little constructive. These are pretty self-explanatory. This one, and this one, accountability, information. So accessible officials and information, we kind of conceived as a bit of a cluster of definitions that might be more appealing to journalists. And then responsive, social, and debate were meant to be about different dimensions of political participation. We thought that those might be more appealing to politicians. So with these definitions in mind, we did set up some kind of hypotheses to proceed. So initially we thought the core hypothesis was this about institutional variation, that where you stand depends on where you sit, that people in different roles would prefer different definitions because of the interests of the job that they're kind of doing at the moment. And so this was what we were really interested in, which is that journalists would rank information, accessible, and officials more highly than parliamentarians, and that opposition parliamentarians would occupy kind of a middle ground between government parliamentarians and journalists, with government parliamentarians at one end wielding executive power, being called upon to make decisions, facing those difficult decisions, and journalists having only the interests of basically producing news stories and holding government to account. Opposition politicians, we thought, might conceivably be in the middle somewhere. On the one hand, they share the interests, the job description with journalists of holding governments to account and ferreting out information. On the other hand, they also have to win elections, and they may very well sit on the government benches soon. So we sort of thought they might occupy a bit of a middle ground. And then to basically be sure that any variations that we did find were actually attributable to the position that respondents occupied, we wanted to include some alternative explanations as possible hypotheses. So we sort of settled on 3 to test for. Ideology, basically, we weren't really sure what to expect, but I mean, obviously the left-right distinction is the major structuring factor in political life. So, but we weren't sure, would left-wing people be more inclined to prefer the definitions that dealt with information and access, or would they prioritize the definitions of participation, or would right-wing? We weren't really quite sure, but we just wanted to include it as a control. And we thought there might be generational effects. Neil Nevitt has a book on Canadian life, The Decline of Deference, that as people get more educated, they're less willing to defer to authority. So we thought that maybe younger journalists might be more inclined to pick the definitions of open government that talked about access to information, politicians being accessible, and having access to officials. And then lastly, I mean, you can't really do anything in Canadian political science without addressing the elephant in the room, which is that we're a divided linguistic society. And so we thought, obviously, there might be variation among the linguistic groups. And there actually was existing research. There's a survey of journalists, Francophone and Anglophone journalists in Canada, that did find that there are different journalistic norms that operate between the two language groups. So we thought that should be important to test for. This is just some details on the survey. So we got a sampling frame of all Canadian parliamentarians. So it's a really good data set. So it was 2014. We got the email addresses from the House of Commons and all the provincial legislatures. That was easy. To get journalists and bloggers, we borrowed our university subscription to a public relations media database and got public affairs journalists and bloggers from there. It was a low response rate, but not fatal. And we got 352 participants in the end. So we came up with a web questionnaire, and we asked people to rank definitions of open government that I kind of provided earlier. And then so respondents could just pick one. That's the one that I sort of prefer to be the definition. That's the least likely, the least preferred. So you could only pick one, or you could only assign a rank to one. There could be no ties. So this got us into a little bit of trouble because the other way of doing it, and probably the more standard way of doing it, would have to ask respondents to rate each definition. Do you agree with this as a definition or disagree? The difference is, of course, with the ranking, a respondent can only give a number to, like the number 1 to one definition. With the rating, you could give the number 1 to all of them. You could agree with all of them. That's actually what we were afraid of. We were a little afraid that when you're dealing with a concept like open government that has a little bit of a motherhood concept feel to it, we were a little afraid that people would just kind of agree with everything. So we wanted to force a little bit of variation in the data. It got us into, it made analyzing the data a little challenging. I'll talk about that a little bit later if people are interested. But so that ranking data, not rating. But there's actually good literature in the methodological literature that gives good advice about how to deal with this. And there's some concrete examples in political science that we were able to use to do it. These are the results. So this was without breaking out by job category, by journalist, parliamentarian, or blogger. These are the results. So this is the most popular definition of open government, information, the second most, third most, and then the least most. So there's nothing really surprising here. They tend to think about it in terms of access to information, number 1, and then access, having politicians be accessible, having access to officials to explain technical details, and the bits about public participation, much less. Our hobby horse actually was more popular than the social media one. So we kind of included the social media one. I mean, everybody's on Twitter, right? And there's a kind of an online engagement story that could be told. And people did actually pick our hobby horse about trade-offs of policies as a more preferred definition. Still, obviously, the tail end, though. The interesting story, though, is when you break it out by job category. So this is the core of, this is the kind of the key, these are the key graphs. This is the core finding. I don't know if I can make it a little bit bigger. Can you see it at the back? Can you make it out? Yeah? Okay, good. So I've just got 4 graphs with each category kind of highlighted in red successively so you can see. So these are journalists, And you can see right off the top, the median ranking for information was 1. So half of journalists ranked information first. And then, so you can see journalists obviously clustered around information, and then followed by accessible and officials. So those 3 clustered concepts about access to sources, access to information, clearly that's what journalists think of when they are asked to define open government. And then the participation ones follow with much less popularity. Trade-offs, again, kind of second in the pack. Journalists and bloggers don't think of social media, engagement on social media, as a dimension of open government. So it's also worth pointing out journalists are there's a high consensus amongst the journalist community that this is really what constitutes open government, is getting information. That changes when you look at government parliamentarians. So again, to reiterate, so these are parliamentarians from all parties, because we surveyed provincial legislatures and the House of Commons. There's NDP, Liberal, Conservative, Separatist parliamentarians, actually not Separatist parliamentarians, they weren't in power, but there's from all party stripes are in this. So the one thing they have in common, though, is they're part of a caucus that exercises government power. You can see, you compare here information compared to journalists, it's much lower. And actually, the median ranking for information was about 3, the same as debate and responsive. So actually, in contrast to journalists, there's no consensus among government parliamentarians about what constitutes open government. There's actually a more scattered sets of definitions or conceptualizations of what that means. And the 2 definitions that deal with public participation are as popular as the definition of information. So government parliamentarians are open to thinking of open government as measures that engage the public. It's a bit surprising. I mean, it seems, I guess, like government parliamentarians actually like, I don't know, engaging with the public or like debate or this was worded, this was to have debate before policy was implemented, and this was worded a policy process that was responsive to public concerns. So, but it's not about, in government parliamentarians' eyes, it's not about getting access to facts necessarily. This one stands out too for government parliamentarians, officials. They really don't like thinking of open government as people having access to their officials. They like to, I guess, I don't know, have access to their own officials on their own terms and kind of have boundaries around them. I thought that was interesting. So if you look at opposition parliamentarians, they do occupy a bit of a middle ground. So if you look at the information ranking, here's government, here's journalists, and there's opposition parliamentarians. If you look at being accessible, here's government parliamentarians, journalists, and there's opposition parliamentarians. Officials, having access to officials, government, journalists, opposition. And then for the public participation definitions, they're about on par with government parliamentarians. So again, this idea is borne out that opposition parliamentarians, they occupy a little bit of a middle ground in terms of their definitions, but also, it fits with the theory that their job description kind of straddles the 2 clusters. On the one hand, they share things in common with government, with the journalists in terms of holding governments to account, but on the other hand, they're vote seeking and they could potentially be office wielding at the next election. And lastly, bloggers. I'm not going to lie, bloggers wasn't a core interest of ours. I'll show it to you anyway. They look a lot like opposition parliamentarians. Perhaps the one interesting thing about bloggers, and it's worth pointing out here, is this social media. We thought maybe that they would think that open government would be about engaging on Twitter and Facebook and such, and none of that, absolutely none of that. They're more like opposition parliamentarians. The people who are open to thinking of social media or open government as engagement on social media are actually the parliamentarians, government and opposition. They're the ones who actually think that, they don't really think it's low down, but they're a little bit more open to that that going on Twitter, going on Instagram, going on Facebook, that somehow constitutes open government. Journalists and bloggers don't sign up for that. This gets pretty thick in the weeds. I think I'm going to skip over it because, these are a visual kind of test of the hypotheses, right? I think it's really reasonably strong evidence. It's not formal. We did in the paper go into some formal tests and they are borne out. I won't go into it except to show what happens when you do control for some alternative theories. So I just need to go here. So this is when we include economic ideology as a control. The more conservative you are, the less likely you were to prefer information as a definition of open government, and the more likely you were to consider trade-offs as a definition of open government. Now, we thought that was a little bit important. Firstly, it does kind of fit with theory. So the more conservative you are, the less likely you are to think of information as open government, and the more likely you are to think of trade-offs as open government. So what is the dominating premise of kind of conservative small market, small government thought? It's sort of scarce trade-offs, right? It's the need to allocate resources, scarce resources. And so open government as trade-offs kind of fits with that. When we get to the discussion about whether open government is kind of a viable concept, this is a somewhat interesting finding because it maybe does hold out some hope that there is a kind of a coherence to the concept, that there's perhaps basically left-wing forces could actually kind of mobilize in favor of something approaching open government and kind of implementing a kind of a program. There is a kind of a left-right dimension to this that maybe could sustain a reform program going forward. So this is after controlling for the effects of position. So the effects of position were still significant, but there's then other effects on top of that. There were some age effects. So as we thought, the older you were, the less likely you were to select information and the less likely you were to select officials. These were actually dwarfed, however, by the language effects. So really big language effects. And we did another test and we found this was not, these are not differences amongst all the Francophone respondents versus all the Anglophone respondents. These were differences that were really restricted to Francophone journalists compared to Anglophone journalists. So this builds on the existing research that we had found and encountered that found that there is a different journalistic culture inside French Canada compared to English Canada. It wasn't it wasn't a finding that we were particularly interested in testing or demonstrating, but it stands out very strongly, and it's perhaps worth looking at, and sort of it's a test case that might open up interesting research into the effects of different norms in journalistic cultures. That's it. These are the major conclusions. Again, journalists preferred definitions of open government that emphasized access to information and sources. Government parliamentarians preferred definitions that emphasized participation. Opposition parliamentarians occupied a middle ground between the two. Bloggers resembled opposition parliamentarians, and these findings were robust for controls for age, gender, and ideology and language. So why do we care about this? There's a few things, I think. So one is when we talk about open government, and as I said, it is a thing in the world. There's NGOs and there's an international organization dedicated to kind of moving this agenda forward. Are we limiting our understanding of what open government could be by sort of restricting it to conceptions about access to information? This is our hobby horse. We could think about open government as about trade-offs, as having hard conversations, open conversations about trade-offs. Is there a coherent definition of open governments across actors? Or is it just kind of a symbol that lacks any kind of coherent core? If it's the latter, if it's a symbol that kind of lacks any kind of coherent core, then it's possible that it may just function as a buzzword in political debate, and it may not actually lead to anything. What may happen is that sort of political actors at opportune times, they simply kind of glom onto it to further their re-election chances, and nothing more. But on the other hand, as I said, maybe that left-right coherent kind of is enough of a variation. Maybe that actually does provide enough of a kind of a staying power that might allow for a bit of sustained conflict over open government and might enable an actual honest reform program. And so this is the question that I'm still asking myself, is Sir Ronald right? Can you have openness or government? That's the sum of the findings. So I'm happy to take your questions.